Good evening to all present. My name is Shruti Jargar and I'm a research assistant at the Institute of Chinese Studies. On behalf of the Institute, I welcome you all to today's edition of ICS Wednesday seminar on the topic, The Politics of China's Demographic Challenge. I'll briefly introduce our eminent guests whose full bios are available on the event newsletter. Leading the discussion on the topic will be Professor Carl Minzner, who's professor at Fordham Law School and senior fellow for China Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations. Professor Partha Mukhopadhyay, honorary fellow at ICS and senior fellow at Center for Policy Research, will provide his remarks as they discuss him. Today's session will be chaired by Professor Patricia Oberoi, who's currently emeritus fellow at ICS and its former chairperson. A very warm welcome to all our panelists. Before I hand over to the chair, I request the audience to take note of the housekeeping rules. All participants shall stay muted during the presentations. Questions can be raised either in the chat box or using the raise hand option during the Q&A session. Please unmute yourself only when called upon by the chair to do so. Thank you. I now invite the chair to take over the proceedings. Over to you, ma'am.
Well, thank you very much. It's an honor and a pleasure and a privilege to be chairing this session. It's a subject in which I've long had an interest from the perspective of a family sociologist, which is where I've spent a lot of my professional time. The question of population is a very emotive as well as political question. And we see it just presently, in fact, in the public sphere in India, where suddenly people have begun debating again, not the first time, population policy. And several states in India have actually introduced population bills, but not they haven't been passed yet, independently of the center, trying to regulate the population by means of birth control, incentives and disincentives for having large families. And in fact, just at this moment in time in India, there has suddenly become quite a debate on this. And you'd be surprised, Mark, to know that a lot of this has something to do with China as well. So that in the one sentence or the one paragraph, public comments on India's population or the need for a population policy are always pointing to China, but in one way or another. The argument is now going that India is the second most populous country in the world, has 1.4 billion citizens. It's smaller than China. It has a slowing rate of growth, but still it's much slower than China. It's much faster than China, I should say. And it's expected, and nobody knows what to make of this sentiment in the public sphere, it's expected to overtake China by 2026 or maybe only 2030. And this creates great frisson in the public sphere, that it is one thing where India is on the point of overtaking China, but alas, is that a benefit or is it not? Now, a decade ago, India's growing population and young population sort of signified the demographic dividend that India was expecting to have by having a young and youthful, potentially working population, whereas China was increasingly aging, which was true. But now the tables are turning, and now people are asking, is that demographic dividend actually a benefit, or is it otherwise? Now, in the public sphere in India, as anywhere in the world, and over a century more of history, there's been many debates on questions of population. They are highly political, but they're also highly personal. They're individual, they concern individuals, they concern communities, they concern the state. And at all these levels intersect in very interesting and often highly emotive ways, which are very important in our everyday politics. I thought about this just recent as we were working up to this, and I'll only be very brief, but I wanted to say that I was once, as it were, a victim of the policy of the Indian emergency between 1975 and 1977 of ruthless family planning. This expression being that we are two and we'll have two, or worse still, two or three children, two or three, that's enough, or stop it. And I became a victim of compulsory sterilization. The reason being that as I expected my third child, a school teacher nearby said, would I allow her to sponsor me being sterilized, because otherwise her promotions would be stopped, which was I didn't mind doing because I thought 3 was a nice number of children anyhow. Now, when it came to the point, and I landed up in hospital and the baby was taken off because she was half strangulated, she was put on a ventilator, and when she came out, she had a strange disability, which I now know is called projectile vomiting. And no doctor would tell me what that was about. And the night before, as they got me ready for the operation, I pushed a button, I sat up in bed, and I said, call a proper doctor to me. Because if you don't explain to me what is wrong with my baby, the show is off. And I threw a tantrum. I hardly ever throw tantrums, and this was one of my really best tantrums. And immediately the whole hospital stood on its head because their reputation was at stake, forcing people to sterilization and so on. And doctors came running and they explained to me that projectile vomiting was a very ordinary thing. They'd grow out of it and don't worry. So off I sailed very happily. Now, what this made me think was that this is the one time in a personal profile of someone socially privileged, for heaven's sake, who was in the same boat as women and in a different way, men, all over India in different states, different policies, but nonetheless, there was suddenly a unity of individual struggling with questions of reproduction. It's a lesson I've never forgotten because it was just part of the common experience of grappling with the state on this. And for heaven's sake, in the Chinese social media over the years, we've read all about these things. So on that sad and happy note, I invite you to present your paper, and I'm sure there'll be a very interesting discussion to come. Please go ahead.
Great. Thank you, Professor Uberoi. I very much appreciate that. I will start sharing my screen now. And Shruti, let me know if there are any problems with this. I think we tried everything out, but please do let me know if anything is going wrong. Thanks so much to the Institute of Chinese Studies for organizing this talk, and to Professors Uberoi and Mukhopadhyay for agreeing to be the chair and discussant for this talk. It's my honor to talk to you today. This is in fact the first time I've ever done a China-related event for an audience primarily in India. And so I'm very interested in hearing your reactions and hearing what you are interested in. My focus is on Chinese domestic politics and law. As Professor Uberoi mentioned, and Shruti mentioned, I'm a law professor at Fordham Law School in New York City. I'm also a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. This, in fact, was my first book that came out in 2018. it's also behind me there. That tracked the social, economic, and political evolution of China as China's post-1978 reform era ended. And it also attempted in that book to look forward and imagine what would happen as China's authoritarian turn under Xi Jinping gains speed. Now I'm working on a different project. I just sort of nailed down the book contract earlier this spring, and it's in a very early stage. It will take me about 2.5 years to write it. The subject of this new second book is about what I see as perhaps one of, if not the biggest challenge facing China over the coming decades, namely the demographic shifts that are currently playing out, and specifically the domestic political challenges that it will create for China going forward. So the structure of my talk will look like this. I'm going to talk a little bit about the overall demographic picture facing China, and then sort of 3 specific examples of challenges that are coming down the road for China. So let me start with the big picture. Like the rest of East Asia, China faces a very significant demographic challenge, and the contours are well known. Once young, China is growing old and very fast. This is both a result of lengthening lifespans, but it's also because of a rapid decline in births. Many of you know this generally, but let me give you 2 specific visuals. The first element is the decline in population. These are 2022 United Nations forecasts that were released last week, so just a week ago, with respect to where China's population might go over the coming decades. The middle, the red solid line, represents the median estimate of where China's population is expected to go. However, based on the actual experience of the rest of East Asia, I suspect that the median estimate that the UN is using is still too high. It's lower than what it was in the past, but it's still, I think, a little too high. And I suspect that China's actual population trajectory will fall between the solid red line and the dotted red line below it. Excuse me, Mike, this light just went off. Not gonna be able to see me, my apologies. So China's population will likely start to decline next year, and its total population will probably be surpassed by India next year. I think actually next year is going to be the year that India goes ahead of China. And of course, this isn't unusual. I mean, so Japan started to hit this point of a declining population over a decade ago, and Japan's population is now dropping by over 500,000 each year as deaths exceed births. And the same thing is happening across East Asia, Taiwan, South Korea, and so on. Nor, of course, is this unique to East Asia. Since many of you are sitting in India, I should probably show you the relevant 2022 projections for India that were also released just last week. You can see that, I think. India is also facing further down the road the same issue of population decline. Of course, it's in India, that's going to take place in another 2 or 3 decades. Even on the median estimates, it's still further out. So China's present is really India's future in this respect. That's the first phenomena that's occurring as a result of the demographic shifts in China. The second shift is aging, rapid population aging. And of course, this is something that is happening worldwide. Currently, our classic mental picture of a really old society is Japan, with nearly 30% of the population 65 years or older. The figures which I'm hopefully showing you, and Professor Uberai, maybe you give me a thumbs up if you're able to see it. Yes, okay, good, okay. These are the official figures from Taiwan and Korea. Taiwan and Korea are on track to surpass Japan by the middle of the century with about 40 or 45% of the population 65 years or older. And all of the recent numbers from China suggest that it's pretty much following in the same trajectory as Korea and Taiwan. And so I can actually show you, these are the relevant figures both for China as well as for India. So it helps to realize that, while this is an issue that China is facing right now, it is also a similar issue that India is going to face much later. However, recognize that China's shift is much earlier and much sharper than India. If you want to look in a little more detail at the two pictures on the left, you'll realize that the scale on the left-hand side is not the same. China's share of the population that is 65 years or older will go up to about 40 or 45%, perhaps by 2050, 2060. India doesn't reach that until perhaps not at all, perhaps until 2100. China is much earlier and much sharper in shift than what's taking place in India. Here, I have to make a big disclaimer. There is nothing right or wrong about having an aging or a shrinking population. For some reason, when I talk about these issues in the United States, some people have real difficulty on this point. They really want to think people are supposed to have more children always, therefore these phenomena are bad. Or other people think, I'm terrified about climate change, so whatever is happening, this has to be good. And I'm not really taking any sides on this issue, on these issues. The only thing I'm interested in is that this demographic transition will create a whole range of issues for countries. China, all of East Asia, and all of South Asia has spent a century dealing with all the problems, all the deep challenges that are associated with going up the curve. More people, large numbers of youth. Now all of them are going to spend a century dealing with the challenges coming down the other side of fewer people and large elderly populations. This transition to fewer people, large elderly population, this is what I'm interested in. And what I'm particularly interested in is how China will respond to these challenges. And for me, particularly because Japan, Taiwan, and South Korea are a little ahead of China on the aging curve, I can look at them, I can see what challenges are emerging, and I can speculate on how China might respond, particularly since the subject of my first book was the political trajectory that China was on. So I'm thinking about how these demographic challenges are going to intersect with China's political trajectory. And if I had to reduce my tentative conclusion to 2 sentences, it is that the demographic shifts that are taking place will pose an incredibly tough set of domestic political problems for China, and that Beijing, particularly given the political direction it is currently heading, is likely to handle this poorly. I'll highlight 3 particular areas as examples, and these are only my tentative thoughts because it's still going to take me about 2 or 2.5 years to write my book. So the first subject is population policy. And as some of you may know, this was a piece that I wrote on in Foreign Affairs just 2 months ago that sketches out some of my thoughts on the subject. But I can summarize them for you here. As Japan, Taiwan, and South Korea have each hit the point where they recognize that demographics will be problematic, each of them has moved towards pronatalism. Essentially, they freak out and they start to say, how on earth do we get more babies? For Japan, this took place in the 1990s. For Taiwan and South Korea, this took place in the early 2000s. For China, it's right now. Chinese authorities shifted their one-child policy to a two-child policy in 2016, and they turned it to a three-child policy in 2021. Some of the things all of these societies have tried are the same: more preschools, expanded parental leave, baby bonuses, financial payments to families. And you can see precisely the same things being rolled out in China since last summer. And that would I believe that the census of 2020 has really shifted the viewpoint of Chinese authorities, and they're very worried about what they see happening now. The effect of these measures in the rest of East Asia has been zero. Fertility rates have continued to drop to the lowest in the world, literally. The 5 societies in the entire world with the lowest fertility rates in the world are Taiwan, South Korea, Hong Kong, Singapore, and Macau. Japan, which is 10th from the bottom, actually looks good by comparison. And China's fertility rates are now also plummeting. They're in those they just went down to about 1.1. So they're in the Taiwan, South Korea zone. Now, one question is, why is this happening? Some of the issues that are taking place are similar to those facing us in the United States or across the world. High housing costs, pressure for additional years of education. These are factors which are driving young people worldwide to delay or avoid marriage and having children. But in East Asia, which remember is at the very lowest in the entire world, there are several other factors that are working as well, namely low levels of non-marital births and strong gender norms. And these are sort of the special factors which are driving East Asia's rates super low. And I can try to explain how that's happening. In many countries, such as the United States, having children isn't necessarily tied to being married. About 35 to 40% of births in the United States take place outside of marriage. In Iceland, it's about 70%. This simply isn't true in East Asia. Extramarital births are very uncommon there. It's about 2% in Japan, 4% in Taiwan. There, if people don't get married, people don't have children. And so the increasing percentage of people who don't get married are one of the key factors, which is driving overall fertility rates to super low levels. And so here's one relevant chart for South Korea, where you can sort of see the number of unmarried individuals is going much higher. And so the question is, well, why aren't people getting married? This is where traditional gender norms come into play. A big part of the story of what's taking place in East Asia is educated women basically saying, if marriage involves me giving up my career to spend my life being the person who takes care of the kids, as well as your in-laws, your parents, the husband's parents, then I'm just not going to get married. And the odd thing is that China should be one of the countries that's best positioned to tackle these issues. It's a nominally socialist country where one of the core planks of the Chinese Communist Party as it rose to power in the 1940s was socialist feminism. The first statute issued by the PRC in 1950 was the marriage law, which guaranteed women's right to divorce. Theoretically, China should be one of the best positioned to address some of these gender issues that are at the heart of East Asia's demographic decline. In fact, you could almost imagine an alternative history or an alternative future in which Xi Jinping calls on male party cadres to do more housework, to take care of the kids, et cetera, et cetera. But China is actually going in the other direction. Under Xi Jinping, China is steadily pivoting in a much more hyper-masculine direction. It's resurrecting traditionalist gender norms. Divorce approval ratings are falling because courts are being instructed to do everything that they can to uphold families and to not anger husbands who might attack judges. I see Li Ke, I see you're on this call. Your book, I was reading it. Anyway, you've got a scholar on this particular subject who tuned in for this particular this talk. And there's a political campaign of Xi Jinping's speeches that are on the family that are now working its way through the Women's Federation with the aim of politically rectifying, the party, the Communist Party's Women's Federation, probably in a more conservative direction. And consequently, what I'm worried about for China is that not only will these measures not work, just like they have not worked in the rest of East Asia, but it's that possible that Beijing, in a fit of desperation, might even start to launch a more super aggressive pro-natalist policy that will have dramatically bad effects on the entire country's demographic future, and particularly on women's rights. I can try to spell this out in more detail, but the key piece would be that I can imagine Chinese authorities starting to reverse the one-child policy, literally, which is to say you bake pro-natalist incentives into cadre assessment policies. Just like one-child policy was evaluate government officials on whether they are controlling birth rates. What I'm imagining in the near future is the reverse, where local cadres are being evaluated on can you bump up fertility rates. And if you do that, I think you're going to start to see all of the abuses that characterize the one-child policy just happen in reverse. That's how you could start to see minimum age requirements for marriage being lowered, increased propaganda about family and motherhood instead of careers being directed at young women, and the availability of abortion being curtailed, just like in the United States. And that could have really bad effects on the entire country's demographic future, and particularly on women. The second topic that I think the issue associated with the rapid aging is going to be retirement and pension systems. Here, I'm just going to try to sketch out some of the issues and questions that are likely to occur. As societies age, the pension promises that made to earlier generations start to become unsustainable. Taiwan's a good example. Taiwan politically, of course, prior to democratization, had a political system that quite resembled that of the PRC. During Taiwan's period of authoritarian rule from the 1940s to the 1980s, nationalist authorities in control of a one-party system built out favorable pension systems for key groups of their own political supporters, teachers, civil servants, and ex-military. Only much later did Taiwan end up constructing something like a universal retirement system covering everyone. By the turn of the century, i.e. 2000, it had become clear that these discrete sectoral retirement systems were financially unsustainable and likely to go bankrupt. But there were decades-long delays in actually moving to reform them, precisely because of the political concerns involved. Indeed, when DPP President Tsai Ing-wen moved in 2018 to restructure those pension systems, one reason politically that she was able to do so was because it disproportionately affected the political base of her rivals, namely the Nationalist Party. And this was the scene outside Taiwan's presidential palace in 2018, right after the Taiwanese government cut the benefit checks for retired teachers, civil servants, and military veterans by up to 15 to 20% overnight. Lots of people, ex-veterans being very upset. And so what might lie ahead for China? China's legally mandated retirement ages right now are 50 for blue-collar women, 55 for other women, and 60 for men. Those ages were set back in the 1950s. Those just aren't financially sustainable under the new demographic realities that are coming for China. China's average life expectancy was 44 back in 1960. It's 77 now. But despite having made noises about raising the retirement age for at least a decade, Beijing still has not taken concrete action to do so. And so I think there are a couple of questions, two questions that are worth asking. The first is, what happens if Chinese authorities actually do move to restructure, to raise the retirement ages? Looking at that photo, what are the moves and counter moves that start to happen? The second question is, what happens if Chinese authorities don't do this? Taiwan was only able to move to address the impending realities because the opposition party was in power and was willing to take financially necessary steps that impacted the base of their rival. In China, the retired cadres, the state-owned enterprise employees, and the urban elites who benefit most from China's existing pension systems are themselves key groups within the ruling elite. And so I think it's really important to consider the possibility that Beijing could find itself politically locked in to maintaining certain financial arrangements much longer than desirable, precisely because the rulers don't want to take action that might harm discrete interest groups. The third topic I'll flag briefly is labor and immigration. As East Asia has aged, countries that have not traditionally been thought of as immigration destinations start to see an inflow of people. And this takes two major forms. The first consists of young people who come on short-term labor contracts from less developed countries to fill blue-collar jobs left open by a decline in the youth workforce, or that are created by a rapidly aging population. In the United States, of course, this isn't what we think of as immigration. They're not citizens. They're not often on a path to citizenship. They don't have the same legal rights as the rest of the population. There's some similarities between the migrant workers in East Asia and the migrant workers, going from South Asia to the oil-rich Persian Gulf states. But they're treated somewhat better, although many of the same abuses, there are abuses that occur in East Asia as well. Nonetheless, these migrant workers are emerging as a long-term component of Taiwanese, Korean, and Japanese society because they fill core economic functions. And the numbers are not small. It's about 3 to 4% of the population in each of these societies. In Taiwan, what this consists of are domestic workers, generally female from the Philippines or Indonesia, who are taking care of the elderly, and also male manufacturing and increasingly agricultural workers, often from Vietnam and the Philippines. And of course, in Japan, you in India, there's also a flow of young Indians working in Japan in the various service industries. So that's the first flow. The second flow that occurs, particularly in Korea and in Taiwan, is international marriages. I can mention that briefly too. in both Taiwan and South Korea, partially as a result of sex ratio disparities, but also other marriage patterns. One of the phenomena that you see in the 90s and the early 2000s is older, less educated, primarily rural men marrying foreign brides from the PRC, from China, as well as from Southeast Asia. These numbers are smaller than the first group. In Taiwan, it's about 1% of the population consists of foreign spouses, and that does open up the possibility for citizenship. And this actually, in all of these societies, it starts to create, Korea in particular, it's creating some really interesting challenges. Korea, traditionally highly ethnically homogenous society, you have dozens of local municipal governments actually providing marriage subsidies to allow to get 60 or 50-year-old aging rural single men to go marry. It's government money that's being used to marry women from the Philippines or the Vietnam, because the local governments think this is how we're going to solve the problem of taking care of the 80 or 90-year-old in-laws. And this starts to create some challenges. So about 6 out of 100 infants born in South Korea last year were just so-called multicultural families. And now South Korea is having to face this interesting question of what it means to be Korean in what was once a very ethnically homogenous society. Currently in China, neither phenomena exists in any significant form. The 2020 census showed only about 1 million foreign residents, and that included people from Hong Kong and Taiwan. And that was the same proportion as existed in Taiwan or Korea in 1990. And since the pandemic, the number of foreign residents in China have just gone down even further. However, all of the underlying pressures that drove these immigration, labor, population flows elsewhere in East Asia are surging in China too. There are declines in China's own population of young migrant workers. Those are the people who used to be filling blue-collar jobs, and there just aren't as many of them anymore. There's also a dramatic surge in the need for elder care because China too is now facing a much larger, older population. And you have significant sex ratio disparities in China's rural areas. And so what I'm trying to think through is what might happen. Might China start to see some of the same trends that have happened elsewhere in East Asia, and how might those play out in China and the politics surrounding it? However, I'm also interested in thinking through the social and economic implications for China if that does not happen. Because I can easily imagine a situation in which political currents in China turn in a much more isolationist or anti-global direction over the next several decades. Because again, that was the subject of my first book, because I view that as very likely. But just to be clear, even if China turns more inward over the next coming decades, I don't think the underlying pressures that I mentioned go away. I think they just start to mutate. And I could actually start to point to a range of examples, namely, particularly cross-border trafficking of women from Burma and Pakistan into China, that might be the leading edge of problems that could start to blow up in the coming decades as a result of the demographic shifts in China and the sort of the new pressures that they start to create. Okay, so the main takeaway that I'd like to leave you with as we move to the question and answer session is that I think China is going to confront some very serious challenges in the coming decades as a result of the demographic changes that it will be undergoing. And I think these challenges won't simply be demographic or economic or social ones. They're also going to be very deeply political ones as well, because Beijing is going to have to start to think about what is it going to do in response to these trends. I'll stop there and I'll just look forward to the question and answer. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Professor Mensah. So I now request Professor Partha Mukhopadhyay to make his comments, which I'm sure will be you'll find very interesting.
Thank you.
Partha.
Thank you so much, Patricia, and thank you so much, Professor Mensah, for a very clearly enunciated talk about how the evolution of China's demographics will perhaps impact the way it sees its politics and what you expect to happen going forward. I must say that I agree with almost all of the diagnosis that you put forward. I think, and especially interesting is the social aspect and the difference in the way in which especially non-marital births are treated in China, which I think is something very striking as you move some of these forwards. And the question to what extent those changes are likely to be relatively slow moving, given what we have seen about in other Asian countries, as you point out. You've had Korea and Japan reach well above OECD average levels of per capita income, but they still remain very traditional in that particular aspect. And the issues I have, and also on the population projections, Patricia, you mentioned about India overtaking China. Professor Minzer mentioned that might happen sometime in the mid-20s. There is, for example, recently, when the census came out, I think Yi Fuxian essentially suggested that China was overestimating its population by almost over 100 million. That instead of being 1.4 billion, it was actually 1.3, or perhaps even a little less. And if so, India may already be the most populous country. And that is what you're looking together is based roughly on how they look at registrations in schools, the number of sort of quote unquote missing children who should be in school but are not in school given the birth rates that were projected earlier, and also the kind of fertility rates that were implicit in the projection between 2010 to 2020, which seem much higher than what you would expect going forward. So I think on those counts, the projections for China's demographics are very much along the lines what Professor Minzer was talking about. The question is, the big question, I think, is also the one that you mentioned right at the beginning, which is the analysis of how China is going to deal with it. And there, Professor Minzer's sort of projection is that it's not going to be able to deal with it well. And I'm just trying to understand that reasoning a bit more. Right? So the first issue is on the GDP front, and to some extent, my sense is one of the things that's happening is this transition is taking place in China when the urban transition is still sort of incomplete. So there will still be a certain amount of benefit that China would get by the urban-rural movement and an increase in productivity that will sort of happen to that extent. That's the first sort of cushion in some sense China has compared to other countries. The second cushion is, of course, the extent to which you would expect increasing use of technology that is now coming in to sort of take care of some of that demographic pressure. And it's turning out to be a somewhat dystopian world. You're sort of seeing restaurants being replaced by food delivery people who then end up getting replaced by drones all over the place. But it is not a world I care to imagine, but it may actually be a world that comes to pass. And how that works in terms of shifting consumptions towards services, towards structures, is an open question. But more interestingly, there is obviously a much larger use of automation in countries like Korea and Taiwan. And the question is to what extent would China be able to follow the same path going forward and retain the kind of political stability that it needs to retain going together. And that's, I think, a tightrope that would be interesting to get your views on. The third is on the pension reform story. Now, India did its pension reforms in 2004. It's not as widespread a pension system. What it did was it essentially grandfathered everybody who was employed until 2004 into the old pension system. And its new pension system is a defined contribution system and not a defined benefit system. Right? So the core issue is whether China can see itself doing two things. One, of course, is the increase in the retirement age. And I would be interested in your views to why you think that could be such a politically difficult decision for China. And the second is to try and see how much, as the Chinese financial industry grows, how much of the movement into a defined contribution system can China sort of start to make, which is the US 401ks, the Indian national pension system that's coming through, and what do you see as the hurdles in that particular structure? Because if in some sense one is able to address some of this, sort of arrest the decline in the GDP due to the decline in the workforce through increased productivity by moving from urbanization, by adding sort of use of more technology in the workforce, and by sort of reforming the pension system, then would the management issues that you fear they haven't been able to do, would they be considerably eased, or would they not be? Finally, two things. One is your views on how the story of Chinese education would change. Currently, as you see, as you move forward in other countries, is much more of a movement from school education to sort of secondary education, moving forward into college education in most of the other countries, partly to increase the quality of the labor force, but obviously also to sort of think through how this structure is coming through, and whether, given the kind of intense competition system the Chinese have with the Gaokao, does one see that at all changing over time? And the extent to which, in some sense, what you see is the other sort of really strong prediction which you make, and which has definite implications for social stability, is whether or not there will be intense efforts to actually push cadres. I mean, this whole behavior pattern that we have seen in the control of the pandemic over the last year or so, whether that will sort of become much more persistent and continue in pushing people towards certain social behavior patterns, especially in, let's say, having more kids, or even go down to just saying, point out elsewhere, the difficulty in obtaining a divorce, difficulty in obtaining abortions, which then sort of might lead to much more widespread social conditions. And the extent to which, and whether or not you think that the kind of social pushback that might happen if these things are starting place, we've already seen some of that pushback happen for the COVID story. Would the party sort of respond to that by realizing that, look, this is not a battle that we can win? We have seen what's happening in Korea, we've seen what's happened in Taiwan, we've seen what's happening in Japan and other places. Let us therefore focus much more on the pension reform stuff. Let us focus much more on the education reform stuff to be able to sort of manage that transition better, rather than try and sort of bury our heads in the sand and try to ensure that this demographic transition does not take place. So it's that, in some sense, I'm trying to understand a bit more deeply as to why you sort of take this viewpoint rather than that, given the party has historically shown itself to be relatively adept at sort of responding to what people's core concerns are in some sense, even though it's thank you so much.
That's a great question, and I'll start with that one. And I think Professor Mukhopadhyay mentioned, that's exactly the impression that many observers have of China. This is the Chinese Communist Party. This is the country this is the party that steered steered China out of, centuries of poverty in 1978 and flexibly responded, and you're an economic miracle. But it's the end of an era. That era was an era in which there was an element of openness and discussion. There was greater flexibility. China was riding its demographic dividend. The party itself had backed out of the Maoist era in which the word of Mao could lead the country in the wrong direction. The 80s and 90s, there was a space within the bureaucracy for having useful discussion. The problem now on the political front is that era is over. The era of pragmatism, the era of under Xi Jinping, as you move back towards the era of one-man rule, the space for discussion over what the correct policy should be, that starts to shut down. And so that's one of the key things that I'm particularly worried about when we're talking about how is China going to respond to all of these new challenges. It isn't just that you're now facing new constraints in terms of the money available. It's one thing to be running China in the 80s when you have an expanding pie. It's a different thing when the pensions are going in a different system, you've got foreign trade pressures, and you start to have external constraints on your money. It's also the fact that when the political system itself starts to freeze up because somebody has now decreed that COVID zero is the one way to go, or that we must do X, Y, Z in some other field, it constrains the ability of political leaders to come up with good solutions. The last question that you'd asked about, why doesn't China look at the experiences of Korea and Taiwan and start to think, well, maybe we should. It's very difficult to do anything with respect to population. The experience of the one-child policy wasn't so good. Maybe we should try something different and just deal with pension reform. You have to realize also that Chinese communists. There was one female member of the Politburo. That's it. The party itself is at the elite level. It's much older individuals, and so the question is, how are those individuals likely to view the demographic pressures and how they should be responded to? I think that one of the reasons, why you see the instinctive reaction which is going on right now is to crack down on the LGBT groups, because you start worrying that, why are people not having children? It's because all these poor ideas of sexuality or fertility are coming in from abroad. Maybe we need to encourage more, if we just went back in a more conservative direction, we could rely on women to help take care of the elders, increasingly elderly population. That is something that in an environment when you don't have very good openness for discussion, it's easy for the system to get led in that direction. And particularly when the one-child policy was literally just, that was like formally less than 10 years ago, still in operation. And so I think it's just very easy, given China's history, to think of population. They love bureaucratically working on statistics and numbers, and setting GDP targets makes sense from an economic planning perspective. And what worries me is I think it's all too easy at the point where they start to see it's a problem. You're going to insert statistical number here that you want your officials to attain, and then the whole system will start to be driven around that. The bureaucracy will start to take over. And so one of the questions in the chat was like, even though the system is much more authoritarian, the dependence on the state is not akin to what that was in the 80s. Party members are limited to 6% of the population. How could you start to see a reverse of the one-child policy? And just recognize that China is a strong bureaucratic state. And so if you started to say, you say, we would like to see individual counties to have 1.8 fertility, and whoever hits that target, it's a bump up for your promotion when you're going to see if you can go from county party secretary up to a higher level. You could easily start at that situation to have county party secretaries start thinking about things, about what's the right message to send to girls in school. You could start having people starting to think about what could we do to make sure that in the next 3 years before I'm up for promotion, those births go higher. Are there ways we could affect the abortion rates in our hospitals? That's the type of dynamic which would make entire sense within the sort of the games that are played within China's bureaucratic state. But once you start doing that, and particularly because the women are not strongly represented at the higher reaches of the party, it's not like you're going to have a strong voice for women's rights. All that stuff starts to play in the wrong direction, and then you could have really negative impacts on women's rights. I mean, some of the other questions that had been raised were, what about the idea that there's the population's estimates themselves could be an overestimate? Yes, I think that's a very, I think if you really should compare the UN stuff that came out last week with 2017. Even the UN itself has been dramatically altering their estimates of China precisely because the new numbers don't fit into the stuff that came out after the 2020 census. They can no longer argue to themselves that somehow this is going up. So I think there's been a reassessment, even if you don't fully buy Yi Fuxian's work, which suggests it's 100 million population has been underestimated. The population is 100 million lower than what it's said to be. You don't have to fully embrace that. You can just simply say it could be that, it could be the UN estimates, but either way, it's not going to be China. India is not surpassing China in 2031. It's not surpassing China in 2026. It's surpassing it this year or next year, or maybe it already has. Things have shifted already, and I think you're starting to see the estimates beginning to catch up to that. Let me stop. I don't want to go into. I can ask.
Right. Right. There are some other questions in the chat box too, and I think there are some questions that Partha asked for reflection on that you haven't addressed. We may get back to that, but meanwhile, I see some raised hands as well. Ravi Bhutulingam, did you have something to say?
Thank you, Patricia. Professor Minzer, that was a really wonderful, excellent talk. Congratulations, clear and concise. My question relates to science and technology, and I just want to build a little further on what Partha mentioned about technology. But I want to tackle it on two fronts. One is, would not the increase in productivity through the new technologies just not be a marginal addition, but in fact, a game-changing order of magnitude kind of difference in productivity? For example, if you take the automobile industry, even today, you have factories with virtually no workers. It's all roboticized and mechanized. Whereas just 10 years ago, that would be one of the high employment sectors. So my first point is that technology is not going to just be a gradual increase in productivity. It could be an order of magnitude difference that it could make. And this applies to many, many fields. The second is the effect of technology on what you might call the supply side. That is, in terms of biotechnology, in terms of bionics, in terms of medical devices, prosthetics, and all manner of things, which might make elderly living not necessarily as debilitating, let's put it, as it might be considered, but could make life more comfortable, more productive, and healthy. Now, this is not going to happen very quickly, but it's going to take some time, but it's also something that needs to be considered. In other words, I would really like to think of technology as proceeding not in a linear slope, but in an escalating pattern, which brings about stepwise changes, and whether we have factored that enough into this equation. Thank you.
That's an excellent question. And I think you raise a really good point, which is particularly, I mean, I think some people, when they talk about population decline or change, they sort of think, well, what's the effect on the economics of the society? And I think your point about technology is well taken. There's nothing automatic. That's one of the reasons why I'm this whole thing of, somehow a country is doomed once Japan is a perfectly functional country for precisely many of the reasons that you raise, which is that, technology, you don't need labor in exactly the same way. But I do think it's important to in response to the idea that technology somehow solves everything. I'm going to push back a little bit on that, say particularly on the elder care front. I mean, Taiwan, well, if you look at Taiwan, Japan, and South Korea, if you look at Taiwan and the semiconductor stuff, just even before I get onto the elder care front, a lot of it's Filipino migrant engineers. So it's not simply that you have you just get the technology. There are many things where you still, when you start to have fewer young workers, you do need to start to think about where might those educated talents flow in. In East Asia, you've started to create ways for that to happen. Will China do that? Will China open itself up in the same way 10, 15, 20 years? If it starts to have that need, can it start to create channels to get people in? The other thing I'll push a little bit on is on the elder care front. I don't think there is a serious problem in all of the societies about aging rural elder. It's not the large cities. And in the large cities, you will have migrants will flow into the cities to provide in Taipei, in Seoul, in Shanghai and Beijing. There will still be flows of workers into the large cities to help take care of the elderly. Where you really are going to need, where the problems are going to crop up, particularly in China, in rural areas. And it's possible that, maybe there will be the invention of the drone something or other that then just solves the problem. But you'll have to talk about it in a, society where the cost, that is a very low GDP area, hundreds of millions of people. Is that really where the technology is going to develop for it? Because if it isn't, you're going to run into all the problems that China's going to run into the problems in the rural areas that it's facing, that rural areas in Taiwan and South Korea are facing now as well. The one other question on the technology front is also to think, what happens to innovation when your society just gets a lot older? And that one I don't have an answer to. I mean, if you think that Silicon Valley and a range of things are fueled by 20 or 30-year-old, what happens when the average age of your society is 45 or 50? That's really what Taiwan and Japan are looking at very soon. Does that start to change how innovation takes place? Okay.
Questions and comments too on the question of technology. If you see in the end of the chat box, Director has
So the use of robots. So part of it is, the use of robots. I mean, part of this, you're telling me, okay, China's leader in robots. Japan's got robots. Taiwan's got robots. South Korea's got robots. All of them have, Taiwan and Korea have 5% of their population that are people who have flowed in to fill low-income jobs. What's 5% of China's population? What would that? Are you talking 50 million, 60 million people in China, 80 million? That's the scale that you're talking about. If you're really saying, well, we can do that. I'm like, but China's poorer than those other societies. And so I do think it's important to think that, if you really want to do the comparison, you have to think what's actually happened in these other societies, and will China respond in the same way? I do think you're correct that there's going to be pressure on this front, but I just to drive it down, remember that where people are thinking of high-end technological developments. I'm thinking of the 80-year-old in rural China who's making like who's making $200 a month, and that's where the technology is going to be driven. I don't know. I mean, maybe, but yeah. Let me see if there are others here.
Yeah, I see a raised hand from Erin Ashraf. Could you come in, please?
Oh, hello. Thank you very much, Dr. Oberoi, and thank you very much, Professor Minzer. It's a fascinating discussion in terms of where we see China going in the future with its population projected to decline. But I suppose it is a scenario they were expecting when they did implement their one-child policy in the beginning, that once they reach a particular stage, how would they then recover or compensate, or how would they address? So two things which I've recently been observing. One is the changes the government seems to, or at the provincial level, they seem to be wanting to do to the hukou system. So, for example, I think it was recently they called on cities with populations under 3 million to get rid of the hukou restrictions this year. So the urban-rural divide in that sense can somehow be adjusted. And just recently, apparently it seems that some of the provinces have raised the minimum payment period for medical insurance, again, to help the underdeveloped areas. So I just wanted to hear Professor Minzer's opinion, and well, what does he think in terms of these issues, which I'm sure they must be aware it may happen, but naturally with new scenarios, new agendas come into play. So these two areas, the hukou system and the medical insurance for the elderly, because as you'll have an aging population, they will probably need more medical insurance to help and all that. So what does he think about these changes to these in these areas that might help?
So one thing you face with the hukou system, and this is not just this actually stretches across the pension, the retirement, the medical insurance stuff, is that they've talked about hukou reform for decades. They really haven't done that much. All of the pushes to do sort of the lifting of the restrictions are really on smaller cities that don't actually provide that many services to begin with. You want to look at the much larger cities to see what's doing with being done with Beijing and Shanghai and Guangzhou, and you start realizing that those restrictions are still very much in place. The problem with the problem they face with the hukou system is that essentially divides the society into two tiers. More favorable benefits, whether it's retirement, whether it's medical, being extended to long-term established urban residents. And so that's also, when I was saying party cadres, state-owned employees, urban elites, that's the 500, 600 million people in the society who are sort of getting the vast, in the pension system, I believe it's about 80 to 90% of the payments. They have sort of two tiers. It's vastly disproportionately structured so that you are maintaining the urban elite. They're the ones who are reaping the benefits of the system. The payouts to people who are migrant workers or in rural areas are extremely low. And so I think that's the issue you're hitting on there is actually one of the core issues, which is truly restructuring that. Whether opening it up, sort of allowing migrants who are resident in the cities but don't actually have a hukou, allowing farmers or people who are outside rural areas to enjoy benefits at a higher level, that really at this point starts to involve questions about, do you want to cut the benefits of the existing urban elite? And Chinese authorities have been very unwilling to do that. Also extends to sort of, do you want to change the college admission policies to begin to, currently they strongly favor existing Beijing and Shanghai residents. Do you want to start to make it easier for rural people to get into Beida or Tsinghua? And if you do that, again, you're going to have some, parents in the urban areas who are quite upset about, why don't we get more college spots? So I do think that that's a difficult, and the reason politically, again, this goes back to a question that I think Partha was asking as well, was, recognize that in a system where you have a one-party system, it's very hard to start to bump up against the interests of the people who are in power itself. It's one thing for the new party to come in and then say, well, we're going to take out the benefits of it, but it's what's the incentives to move against the children and the beneficiaries of the party and the associates itself. Partha, Professor Mukhopadhyay?
Please, Partha, do come in.
Quickly, if I just sort of take a couple of things on from what we were just saying. One is, can it be the case that the importance of cities like Beijing and Shanghai may actually decline in terms of its economic importance? The fact that you will have relatively large cities, I mean, Beijing and Shanghai are like super large, and you are now trying to bring the big Bay story around Shenzhen, Guangzhou, Hong Kong, and so on. And maybe that too, but that area has always been much more welcoming of migrants and the number of long-term temporary residents in Shenzhen and so on and so forth. Because the economic importance of the mid-levels of the other large cities, whether it's the other state capitals of Chongqing, of Wuhan, of others, is quite strong. And these are these are relatively vibrant economic cities. They're pretty large at scale. They can do a lot of things that Beijing and Shanghai can. And therefore, would it mean that much of a loss if Beijing and Shanghai were sort of to continue on their little exclusivist sort of things going forward, but the rest of it, the hukou reform sort of happens. That's one. And the second is exactly as you said, right now, there is this, how do I get into Beda? How do I get into Tsinghua? How do I get into a couple of Fudan and things like that, right? But the big difference with the US, and there's the same thing in India, with a very small number of very well-functioning universities, getting less and less by the year, unfortunately. But if you look at the US, the core thing is, look, if you don't get to Harvard, it doesn't really matter that much. Because if you get into SUNY, or if you get into Fordham, or if you get into something else, you get an education that is not going to set you, it might change your cohort and the people you know, and the connections you make and the networks you have to some extent. And that might sort of make a difference in your lifetime earnings a little bit, but it's really not the end of the world, right? Whereas if you don't get into Beda, but you get into sort of Leaping Gorges University somewhere in the middle, then it really makes a large difference to your life outcomes. So is it then possible that the next story is about actually moving to a university system that's much more similar to the US, where the gradient in terms of quality or whatever you want to call is much gentler, and there's a large number of relatively well-functioning higher education institutions, which doesn't make this demand for these elite spaces that much stronger. So while the elites will remain, and the Beda and the Tsinghuas and the Harvards and the Princetons of the places will have their roles, it will not create as much disaffection as might be expected it won't sort of exacerbate the stuff which might be expected if Xi Jinping sort of continues this Maoist one party, one man kind of story, which then concentrates all the opposition into not just against the party, but against a person. And can all these sort of opposition be diffused by sort of these kinds of interventions, which sort of focus more on the mid-sized cities, that focus more on creating a broader base of education? I'm just trying to paint the more optimistic scenario and sort of ask me to respond as to where you see the problems going in that direction.
Well, I think on the education system, and I think you've got your finger on an interesting question. Youth unemployment in China is now sort of way up. I think it's closing in on like 20%. It's among the highest that it's been in a while. Of course, this is partially pandemic. It's partially tensions with the rest of the world. But there's another factor too, which is that China's education has they launched a very big boom in universities in the late 90s, and you are seeing university enrollment went very high, And so the colleges are pumping out lots of four-year graduates. And now increasingly, those young people aren't able to get jobs. And this is a top priority for Xi Jinping right now. What do we do about this? One of the elements that they're trying to going forward is they're attempting to ramp up vocational education. Essentially, Beijing is making the call that we may have gone the wrong way in terms of encouraging people to go to four-year colleges. We need to have more technical skills training. And I don't know. I mean, so this is a little bit outside my expertise, but I think that is an important subject to keep your finger on. And the idea that will families or children who are in high school make the decision that, I don't need to get into a four-year college as long as I can get into a technical training school and I think I've got a good job afterwards. There's traditionally been this idea that, the higher the degree, the university degree is higher than like a Bunke or like a vocational degree. And I don't know if, Chinese authorities could start to alter that mentality. But yeah, I mean, that would be interesting. It'll of course be tied up because the kids are going to be looking for what are my job prospects, where can I go, and what's the salary that I'm going to be able to make. But this is definitely a top subject that authorities are worried about.
Carl, there was a question, a related question in the chat box from someone who wanted to know about the the relevance of the cost of bringing up children. Is such a detail with education and with everything else. In what way could this be tackled as a problem? I think you can see it somewhere in the chat box.
Yes, I see it. Yep, that's exactly right. So that Chinese authorities themselves have, particularly last summer, they are very aware, and this is why I think this is a top priority for reducing currently. Starting my interpretation is when the results of the 2020 census started coming out in 2021, Chinese authorities were very worried and they started looking around to sort of see why are people not having children. I think you're correct. Nishant in the question said, yeah, one of the things that they focused on was that it's actually very expensive. And so particularly for Chinese authorities, they looked around, they thought that the education system in particular, the costs associated with the education system were deterring people from having children. Particularly, it's not just the costs of, paying for school degrees, but it's also the idea, which is correct, that particularly in the big cities, there's an educational arms race. So it's not just going to school; it's also the after-school tutoring. The children and their parents in the cities feeling like I need to have my kid take cram classes in order to get better prepared. So Chinese authorities last summer came in with a very tough decree, which basically wiped out the private tutoring industry in China overnight. Major companies, New Oriental, that were providing sort of, after-school tutoring, it was all rendered illegal. And that was, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people who were in these, I'm a 20 or 25-year-old who helps prep kids for, boom, your job's, now you can't be engaged in that.
I think that was directly related to the question of population. Yeah.
Absolutely. They were very clear. There was a series of directives last summer where they said, we want to remove the barriers that are preventing, and we've identified this as a barrier. So we're just going to move in with an administrative decree to sort of wipe this out in kind of a heavy-handed manner, which many parents kind of appreciated. But other people were like, well, other people are just going to have somebody, illegally come to their home as a nutritionist or something. But in reality, so it's all going to go under the table. But yes, I think this is the type of thing. And Chinese authorities think that this, they're in a watch and wait mode right now to see if this starts to change things. I'll be curious to see if it actually does.
Well, certainly sociologists working in India find that on family dynamics, find that people are counting the cost of education in every sense, like the actual cost, the cost in labor, the parental supervision, the ancillary things that go on to getting children good education, is something that makes them really want to keep their family the number of children limited. So that is something that is very strong here too, and strongly documented. the government has not been able to stop the spectacular rise of coaching schools, even though many of them are right at this moment embroiled in scandals for manipulating the competitive entrance examinations right now.
And just one more thing on that point, just recognize that there's this, I think it's worth, I mean, India's younger, so I'm not sure that people fully start to think of the dynamics that can happen further down the road. This is decades in the future, but just realize that that dynamic, when the population is younger, it starts to be, you know, in more traditional societies, it's first the woman, the mother, starts to have the pressure to sort of like, I'm the one who's going to manage this. And that becomes an additional set of responsibilities that's placed on her. As the society gets older, recognize that there's the other set of pressure that starts to come in is also taking care of the much older generation. I mean, if the population is 30, average age is 30, the in-laws are 60, that's not a problem. As the age creeps up, you start to have the parents themselves are in the 40s, and the in-laws or your own parents are in their 80s. So one of the other things that starts to happen, one of the disincentives to marriage, to having children, is once the woman or any parent, but particularly women, start to think, well, I'm getting myself in this role of needing to just take care of a lot of people, there start to be a set of responses of children and then not getting married. And it really does begin to create a dynamic. And people don't often realize, well, government authorities don't realize that because they just sort of think this is, the women take care of this. And then they start realizing, actually, this is a lot bigger than, sorry.
Especially with the conservative turn, if you like, in the Chinese political sphere. So I think we're more or less finished our time. But there was a very interesting question latterly from Yukti Panwa in the chat box. Who wanted to know about medical facilities, the availability for medical facilities for married mothers, the unmarried mothers, I presume, that cannot be available for single women. Yeah.
Excellent question. And this I find, Yuki, I think this is the really interesting question, because this is where the conservative norms and the sort of desire, this instinctive desire on the part of party authorities, more population, they come into conflict. Because you could imagine that if Chinese party authorities really wanted to run through with their pro-natalist stuff, you'd start saying gay and lesbian parents should be able to have children. Single women should be able to use IVF but the systems currently aren't set up that way. It's only recently has it been made easier for single women to get a hukou for their child. There's huge numbers of disincentives, benefits that are available for married women who have children aren't available to single mothers. And the logical thing is, why not start relaxing that? But that's where the conservative gender norms come into play. And again, it's not just China. The same thing crops up in Taiwan and in Japan. Do you make IVF, in vitro fertilization? Do you make it available to single women? Because if you start doing that, that starts to come into conflict with those conservative norms. And so in many of these societies, that's a real battle. And particularly in China, I have a sense as that conservative social norm shifts, that's just not going to be a direction that party authorities under Xi Jinping are willing to go, notwithstanding the fact that it's totally logical based on what you're just talking about.
Yeah. And one sees that other societies have been through this. Currently in the UK, there's such a scandal regarding the children of unwed mothers snatched away from them and given up for adoption because they were not supposed to be having them. So this is a very interesting thing. Now, I think we should probably wind up. Partha, could you, if you have a question, could you be very brief with it?
Quick final question, Professor Mensah. So let me pose a counterfactual, which is, let's assume that the era of Deng, with the kind of institutional reforms that took place, had continued, and that this was Xi's last term and somebody else would have come in at the end of which might still happen, but that's the kind of structure that took place. And what you saw with Hu Jintao and others would sort of continue further into the future. Would you see the future differently than what you're seeing it today? I mean, how much of the way you see the future is determined by the current institutional situation of the Chinese Communist Party?
That's a good question. I mean, that's an interesting one. I mean, I guess the short answer is I feel much has already been locked in. I mean, so I feel like the trends that have been taking place politically really go back, much further. It's not something that can be just shifted one way or the other. But if you're just asking me, if you imagine an alternative 15 years ago, where some of the other experimentation was somehow able to continue, could China have ended up in a position where they more flexibly respond to rising pressures that they face? I have to say yes. I mean, it would probably still be a one-party system, but I could see there potentially being more space for open discussion of the kinds of problems that China is facing. And what I worry now is that that's not happening, and it can't be reversed on a dime. I mean, I think the way that developments have happened in China, it is now locked itself in a particular direction. This is the politically. Demographically, of course, like these are much bigger changes than the party itself. These are changes that are facing all of East Asia. And the real question is, do you come up with a better or a worse way to address them? And time will tell exactly what will happen in China. But at a minimum, it's currently on the trajectory to go exactly the same direction as Taiwan, South Korea, which creates huge problems for them going forward. And that's even in a democratic system where you have, all problems are getting raised. Women are out there talking about issues that they face. I just don't know what the future will hold for China on this front.
Well, Partha, thank you for that question, which linked us back to Carl's previous book, and linked it up to the forthcoming and present one, of which we've had a little preview here. I think that there's many other things that could be talked about at this point, and many lessons to be learned, and many comparative thoughts to be put out. I think that looking at China in this regard definitely is something that this country needs to ponder over, as people are beginning to think they need new population policies of one sort and another. I think that one of the very important questions you raised, which we could only just touch briefly, were the gender dimensions of this whole issue. And there's a lot more work to be done, a lot more discussion to be done. Another aspect which came up only latterly is the question of employment, unemployment, underemployment, and its relationship to, population. And thirdly, I think that the lesson that history tells us, including this history of the Chinese experience, but from Europe, say in France from the 19th century onwards, is that population control may be relatively easy, though with pushback, but population pronatalism is extremely hard to achieve. And the countries in Europe have been struggling for a century or more to boost up their population without opening their immigration doors, which is something, of course, a little big problem that you brought in near the end. The other question that one might also ask in the Chinese context is that, are they thinking of pronatalism for some, that is the majority Han population, and antinatalism or population control for others. Now, this is certainly an issue which is immediately apparent and has been in the Indian context. One group, various or different groups in Indian society are supposed to be breeding much faster than others. It's not, and therefore their population should be controlled, and the other people should be advised, as they were elsewhere in Europe, also in the 20s and so on, to produce more and better quality children like themselves, mainstream children. So I think that question is still lying out there, and the many manifestations of gender issues are to be turned up. So I think that we can only wish this book well, give apologies to those who had questions still unanswered. There are lots of questions going forward, and we can only say that this has been mind-opening, mind-boggling, and a lesson with reference to our contemporary discourse in the public sphere in India. So thank you very much, and I'm sure I'm speaking on behalf of everyone else present too.
Thank you.